Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board. Finally, the international break is over and Norwich City are back in action tomorrow afternoon when they take on West Brom at Carrow Road. You know the drill here on Tactics Board. Even though it's been a couple of weeks away, we will first of all go through the predicted 11, the team that I think Johannes Hoftorp will choose for the game, the sorts of debates around the team selection that he'll have to decide upon before tomorrow's game. Then we're going to have a bit of a closer look at West Brom, the sorts of threats that they pose. And then finally, I'm going to talk about why tactics don't matter at the moment for Norwich City. And that probably is quite an interesting discussion, given the fact that this programme is called Tactics Board. So stick around for that. But first of all, we're going to look at the players I think Torop will choose with the predicted starting 11. So without further ado, here it is. So I've gone with Angus Gunn in goal, Kellen Fisher at right back, Shane Duffy and Jose Cordoba in the centre of defence, with Callum Doyle at left back, Kenny McLean, Emiliano Marcondes and Marcelino Nunez in midfield, with Ante Sienat on the right, Borja Sainz on the left and Josh Sargent through the middle. Up front, a couple of situations there for Johannes Hoftorp to deal with. Of course, Gunn is back fit and available after a few weeks out with a hamstring injury. Not really much of a decision to be made there, but of course a change that we'd expect to happen with Vicente Reyes and George Long filling in over the last 3 games. I think it's quite clear that Angus Gunn will be back in the team, and I'm sure Torop will be pretty pleased with that. In fact, I can tell you that he is, because that's what I asked him about at the pre-match press conference, and he said, yeah, it's a big bonus for Norwich to have him back for these last 8 games of the season. I think there's another discussion to be had about whether Norwich go to a back 3. I actually wrote a piece about this, and I think there's been a bit of debate after the second half against Bristol City, when of course Norwich did change to a back 3, but I think much of the success they had as a result of that came from the fact that Bristol City themselves set up with a sort of back 3, back 5. I think that allowed Norwich to mostly dominate the midfield, even with 2 players only in there. But against most teams, when you have 3 in the midfield, it's quite hard to dominate games and to really get control of the engine room if you have got numerical inferiority. And that's part of why Torop likes to have inverted fullbacks, because on top of the 3 that he usually plays in midfield, you've got the fullbacks coming in, dominating the game. I remember actually a game early on in the season against Watford when they played a midfield 2 and Norwich just dominated them through the middle of the park. They had so many more numbers in that area. And if Norwich want to dominate the game, which Torrop's talked about, which Ben Napper's talked about before, and I think having that density in midfield is a really important part of it, and I don't see Torop going away from that. I also think in the long term it will be a 4-3-3, because that's what he's played throughout his career, and when he's building for next season, which is what it feels like a lot of these final 8 games are about, I'm not sure he's going to be thinking too much about playing a system that fixes things for the next few games. I know he's refused to give up on the Championship playoff race. He said that he has to keep believing. That's sort of part of his job, I think he believes. But right now, with so much of that focus on the long term and on next season, it would feel quite a strange move to almost waste these final few games by using a system that none of the players are really going to be using going forward. So I think it will be a back 4, and in that back 4, or in front of that back 4, I think there's a bit of a decision to be made in midfield as well. Of course, Marcelino Nunez fit after an international break, which is a nice bonus, and that does leave Torop a decision to make. Of course, Nunez didn't start against Bristol City, more of a fitness thing than anything else, and they will try to ease him back in, but I think after 2 full weeks training back with the team rather than being away with Chile, they will feel confident that he is able to start again. And then it comes down to a choice between sort of him, Marcondes, Slimane. Of course, Jakob Sorensen is somebody who, to much malign, has played a lot of minutes over the last few weeks, but I think he's quite clear, and he's almost referenced this slightly explicitly or slightly directly without really confirming it, but I think he's he's been quite clear that this is his best midfield three at the moment. I think Slimane's been decent over the last few weeks. We, of course, spoke about him a lot on the last episode of Tactics Board. So if you want more on how he's been unlocked a little bit, then go back and watch that. But I still think this is his best midfield three. Of course, none of them were away on international duty as well. Slimane was with Tunisia. Oscar Schwartau was with the Danish under-19. So that will probably come into consideration for Torup as well. So I think it will be a midfield of McLean, Marcondes and Nunez. And then the front three probably speaks for itself. So yeah, it will be interesting what Torup does with that team. I think some debates that are fairly easy to settle, but in terms of whether he ever goes back to that back three for the rest of the season, and if he changes anything in midfield, it should be interesting when that team news drops tomorrow afternoon. On to West Brom, and another team that has a lot of strengths. That's what Norwich saw when they drew 2-2 with them at the Hawthorns earlier on in the season. Of course, at that point, they had Carlos Corberán in charge, but there hasn't been too much of a change in the way that they do things. They build things up slightly differently at the back, but in terms of how they want to play, they want to press quite high, they want to attack quite directly at times, but also have the ability to mix it up. So in a performance that Torup was quite happy with earlier on in the season, there were plenty of things that Norwich can now take and apply at Carrow Road, but they will want to be slightly more dominant. There were some nice passes, some nice passages of play that created chances for them at the Hawthorns, but most of them were coming from West Brom dominating and creating chances and maybe not putting them away, and then Norwich advancing almost in a counter-attacking sense. A lot of the time it was them taking advantage of the West Brom press, but they will hope to do that at times, as well as also gaining territory, controlling the ball in the West Brom half, and that's probably the area that will be more difficult for them in a tactical sense, at least in terms of technically, if they can be at their highest level and they can, to make the most of the West Brom press, they can exploit those spaces that are left as they did at the Hawthorns, then they've got a chance there. But Tony Mowbray's side will be pretty well drilled. They will be quite solid, and Norwich will have to be at a much better level in terms of their passing out from the back, how quickly they do it, the quality of their passes to be able to take advantage of that. So not an easy test by any means. Of course, they do have the ability to go more direct, to put crosses in the box, which is something that Norwich have struggled with at times, maybe not necessarily against Bristol City, but in recent weeks. Sheffield Wednesday, a good example, Oxford United as well. So from those and set pieces, they'll need to be alert, but there are opportunities for them if they're strong technically, as they were earlier on in the season. The fact that they've got somebody like Nunez back, the fact that they've got Mate Jarasek to come off the bench, they've got some more technical players really to help them in that attacking phase of the game and in their build-up. I think that's a huge positive for them, and they'll try to make the most against West Brom this weekend. Now, I wanted to finish with a little bit of a discussion about whether the tactics really matter that much anymore to Norwich in their bid to improve upon their poor form in recent weeks. Of course, just one win in 8. They'll need much more than that in the final 8 games of the season if Johannes Torup is to realise his dream of playoff qualification, which he says isn't the be-all and end-all as far as this season goes, but it's certainly something he's still hoping for, even if it does look slightly unrealistic at this point. But right now, it doesn't feel like the tactics are really the problem. Norwich are doing quite well between the two boxes. They're creating chances. They're not conceding loads and loads of chances, but they're conceding many goals. They're not putting away enough chances to make up for that. And when you look at what that is, I think it's quite an easy explanation. They're underperforming their XG for. They're seriously underperforming their XG against. And what it comes down to a lot is just the quality in both boxes, the quality of the individual defending, the one-on-one defending, whether to slide to make a block, whether to stand your ground, how close they're getting to the striker, how well the goalkeepers are doing in those situations. At the other end, putting away the chances when they create them. So a lot of what Torup will be trying to do is build up the individual confidence and the quality and the decision making, so that when they do get into the good positions that they've been getting into over the last few weeks and the last few months, really, they're making more of that. So at the moment, Obviously, to an extent, it's on the coaches because it's their jobs to improve the players. That's a big part of why they were brought to Carrow Road. But it's also on the players rather than necessarily just the tactics, because I think we've seen the impact that the tactics can have. I think Norwich have been quite dominant in a lot of games. They have been losing by fine margins, and you can say that's unlucky, that they could have had more points, or you could say that Norwich need to improve in both boxes. And I think I would err on the side of the latter, because it does feel like that's where Norwich have been particularly weak. And in the final 8 games of the season, they need to continue performing in the same way in terms of the system and the setup and how effective it's being. But they really need to improve in terms of their defending, their decision making at both ends. And that's something that I'm sure Torres will want to see from his players over the next few games. So we'll see what happens in those. Of course, it all starts against West Brom tomorrow. We'll have every kick of that game covered over at pinkun.com/subscribe. So go over there if you haven't already, and you'll have access to all of our content. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board, and I will see you very soon.